go live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the PTRC Fireside Chat. I'm very sorry about our technical difficulties today. I'll quickly hand over to Glenn so that we can get this event going.
Thanks, Brogan. And yes, the show will go on, and perhaps rather fittingly, whatever technical glitch has been thrown our way, it's playing with our emotions, and this is very much in tune with today's theme for the Fireside Chat. But first of all, whether you're here to listen to the recording or you've made it across to the live event, welcome back to the PTRC Fireside Chat series and our latest event, number 17 indeed. My name's Glenn Lyons and I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at UE Bristol in the UK. Thank you for joining us and I hope you enjoy the session. Please be sure to get involved if we're live by using the chat bar to raise issues and questions. I had hoped to ask a couple of Menti questions to get a sense of the mood in the room from all of you, but that will have to be put to one side. In 2 weeks' time, COP28 takes place in the United Arab Emirates. We're currently in the hottest year on record. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has said this year that the era of global warming has ended, the era of global boiling has arrived. In the face of inadequate climate action globally, he's also said that humanity has opened the gates of hell. Today, we turn our attention to climate action in terms of limiting global warming, something the United Nations refers to as stepped-up efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Stepped-up efforts are certainly called for from our governments and major corporations, but we need stepped-up efforts from everyone, directly in terms of our own carbon footprints, but also in terms of how we can play a part in helping change the system. Some of you may recall the secret transport planner from another Fireside Chat earlier this year. Just before today, they got in touch with me, secretly of course, and amongst other things said the following. There is a point where you can't say, but I still believe we can turn this round. The words become hollow and false. People inside their heads reach the conclusion that their sacrifices aren't going to make a difference. So they turn away, hoping, even if they believe in the science, that it's all a false alarm. And anyway, there's the next weekend break to Cornwall to plan, just another 500-mile round trip. Sobering and rather alarming, it seems to me. On the matter of climate action, as individuals, we can face the temptation to give up hope, but also the tiring sense of relentlessly having climate change within or dominating our field of view. Meanwhile, as I've been reading this week, anger, prompted by perceived violations of morality and fairness, can be a strong motivator for turning to activism. Perhaps some people skimmed over the promotion for this event, thinking here was yet another item online containing the words climate change and climate action. Indeed, maybe they feared falling into the clutches of the tofu-eating wokerati. But I hope those of you who are tuned in here will be rewarded, because this conversation is not so much about the imperative for urgent climate action or being reminded of possible dire consequences of inaction. Instead, I'm looking forward to a more human dialogue with the opportunity to hear from 6 climate heroes of mine, all of them in their different ways being climate activists. I want to focus upon what motivates them to do what they do. I want to give us more insight into the different forms climate action can take. And perhaps we'll also learn some more about their own vulnerabilities and battles and how they see their ongoing efforts in the months and years ahead. My hope is that many of you in the audience will be concerned humans who are asking, what more can I do? And that our event will offer you some inspiration to be able to answer such a question. So, with the scene setting in place, and without further ado, I'd now like to turn to our wonderful panel and to hear some opening remarks from them. So, Hiba, if you'd be kind enough to kick us off, please, with your thoughts.
Hi, thanks everyone. So I guess I wanted to just start with my approach towards climate action, and then I'll go into a bit more of the detail. But it's always been driven by just trying to do the right thing, looking at where I can have greater and greater impact. And that's been, building and building and building, and how can I do more? up to a point when I realized over the last few years that I also have to temper that with the things that really energize me and bring me joy. And there are things that might not make a difference. I hope that those ripples will be felt further on, but even if they didn't, they still bring me joy. They bring me the energy to continue with the other parts that aren't so easy or aren't so joyful. So that's been a really important theme. And so, in that kind of professional part of my life, and I split it into two, professional and personal and full of joy, I've moved from a career in engineering into international development. And I work on large flood defense and irrigation schemes across the world. And there's a heavy focus there on, climate adaptation and climate mitigation and coping with rising sea levels and extreme temperatures and how to make resilient food systems. So through that role, I have really been able to take climate action, but I could only do it on 1 or 2 projects. Not that that's not very much. But for me, building upon that role and always looking at where the next impact was how I build upon climate action year on year. So then actually taking on the role of sustainability and social outcomes lead for the whole of this unit, that's hundreds of projects that I can then start to impact, influence, see how, we can mainstream climate action a little bit further, develop more sustainable solutions. And then using that platform, I was able to build a relationship with the United Nations Global Compact and the UK network. And that's, the largest corporate sustainability initiative in the world. And it brings together UK-based organizations to really drive sustainable business and further the sustainable development goals. And so that was my, building, always striving, always being better. But I guess the other side to that, to temper that, is the personal side that brings me energy, brings me joy. And it helps me cope with those feelings of helplessness or hopelessness or wanting to give up. And joining climate marches is number one for me. I've always found them to be incredibly joyful, full of hope, full of like-minded people, and just a really nice day out. And being able to take my child, when he was only 4 months old, and continuing to take him as he grows into a toddler, that for me is just the most amazing bonding experience with full of like-minded people. And then there's so many other things that I do that also, small things that just bring me real joy and satisfaction. Boycotting consumerism, boycotting Amazon, buying little and buying secondhand, planting vegetables in my neighbour's allotment and watching them grow, or writing letters to MPs and supermarkets and carpet shops and and just being really irritating. Or one of the best actions that I did with Extinction Rebellion was going out in the night and secretly planting wildflowers in the grass verges. The amount of joy that brought not only me but the whole community was something that just really enriched the way that I want to approach things and to leave that legacy that I would like to see.
Yeah, but that's a wonderful start for us. Thank you very much. And I'm sort of feel envious about the breadth and depth of your climate actions and that lovely sense of how you've been building up and up over time. And whilst I know we're just sort of in the introductory remarks phase, but I'd love if you could just say a little bit more for us about this notion of bringing you joy. Can you sort of take us inside your emotions a bit more? What I can appreciate the sort of wildflowers on the verges, but are there other aspects of the joy that you feel that you can sort of explain a little further for us?
Yeah, I guess it's just something, and maybe it's a really human thing of getting back to basics. There's something in, growing your own vegetables, living slowly, living well, not always rushing around, flying off here and there, but actually just enjoying that really short walk with your toddler that takes 2 hours. I think that kind of slow down that's come with the climate movement to me has really helped just appreciate the joy. So taking the time to do that stuff and not always being busy, busy, busy.
Yeah. And your young daughter, I imagine over the time ahead, there'll be a stronger and stronger connection you can have with her in terms of sharing that joy. Perhaps you're doing that already and feeling it.
Yeah, and the allotment example is just exactly how I would have always dreamed of raising a kid. My neighbor plants pears, and so he goes off and picks a pear and eats the pear, and that's just exactly, how I would have loved to grown up myself.
Wonderful. Thanks, Hiba. We'll be back to you, of course. But Steve, can I come to you now for your opening thoughts?
Thanks, Glenn. I'm at the moment, you'll find me on a website, greentravelwriter.co.uk. I write travel articles for magazines about travel without driving or flying. I retired from my sort of day job as a lecturer in transport planning in the same department as Glenn last year. And I'm also working with the rail industry on plans to try and promote walking by rail. Now, over the past sort of 30 years or so, I've done quite a number of things about climate change. I became really conscious of it back in the 1990s. The first thing I've got a record of having done was in 97, when I sort of persuaded the Liberal Democrat conference, I was a parliamentary candidate back then, to vote to impose a cap on the volume of aviation, followed by a gradual reduction thereafter. And I've often wondered if people had taken this threat seriously back then, whether we would be in a much better position today, as I think we would. Now, over the years in between, I've done lots of things. I set up a branch of Friends of the Earth and helped to campaign for the Big Ask, which led to the UK Climate Change Act. I decided personally to stop flying back in 2005, and then to stop driving in 2009, and I've stuck to those ever since. During my sort of years working at UWE, I sort of gave some advice to government departments, which they later came to regret, local authorities, UK Climate Assembly. But like a lot of people involved in that, I was becoming increasingly frustrated with the situation. And the lack of progress, while the science was raising the alarm bells. So from 2019 onwards, I was arrested 4 times with Extinction Rebellion. I have 1 conviction for 2 counts of public order offences. Now, at some point in all of that, we passed the point as a nation and as a species where catastrophe could have been avoided. I think that's a fact. I understand why people take the view that we mustn't be despondent, we have to carry on hoping, but the context in which we are acting today is quite different. It is more difficult to motivate yourself to say, the best that we can now do is hopefully mitigate the scale of that disaster. It's still worth doing. I think that the activist movements have, in some respects, lost their way. And I'm not quite sure where we go next, but I'm sure we'll have more to say about that later. Thank you.
Yes, Steve. Yeah, and perhaps for the benefit of others, and I know I've said it to you before, but as a fellow academic and indeed a colleague at UWE, my admiration for you grew in leaps and bounds, I have to say, as I came to realise and things came into focus more and more about what you had been calling out for so much longer than many of others of us. And it was with a lot of pride seeing you put yourself through the emotional experience of being arrested and to some extent vilified by parts of the mainstream media. And it was certainly an inspiration for me, though I can't hand on heart say I've followed in your footsteps just yet. But just before we move on to the other introductions, your remarks gave a real sense of the journey you've been on, but perhaps going back to the 1990s, a belief that you were there in good time to avoid the problems that you saw downstream, whereas now perhaps there's a degree of, well, you know, we've lost the to have that level of drive and optimism perhaps behind taking action. Is there a sense that your emotions have changed significantly over that period?
I mean, yes, they have. I mean, this is always a roller coaster, and today I haven't done. I mean, the last sort of active thing I did was to go on the big one, which was just a march in London, which I gather you were also at, Glenn. I feel that I should be doing more. I'm trying to explore some other ways, some different ways to get involved, which I probably shouldn't be talking about yet. But yeah, I think anyone who embarks on this course will find themselves torn between this sense of hope and worthwhile, and the sense of the whole thing passing you by, and that can be very frustrating.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve. We'll come back to you, of course. Next up, Greg, please. Please, can we have your perspective? Another hero of mine, as I've said, you all are, but I'm sure you'll tell us why in particular I see you up in lights when it comes to climate action.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I welcome on to talk about the freedom of information request that I made to the Department for Transport and being a bit of a thorn in their side. I mean, I guess just to open with, I think I personally struggle with the scale of the challenge and where we are most days, and then on the days where I don't struggle with that because I've been locked up in doing other stuff, I then struggle with the fact that I haven't been thinking about that at some point. So it affects me every day. I guess I've always been someone who's worked within the system and takes a lot of time to build trust with organizations. And this is, I mean, as Steve said, it's such a long-term issue that people have not really been engaging with it. So I've spent a lot of time building knowledge about the scale of the challenge and talking about what could be done. But I guess I've reached a point now where I'm too late maybe, but we've kind of begun to institutionalize climate change and say that we're tackling it, but we're not actually doing what needs to be done. We're institutionalizing failure in some respects. And so it's time to speak out, but picking the right times to speak out. You know, sometimes better is okay, and sometimes better is just BS, and we need to we need to really address that as an issue. So in 2022, I submitted a freedom of information request to the Department for Transport to just explain what was in their transport decarbonisation plan, what it actually meant for people. I mean, I asked informally for the data first because I just thought, well, that was standard government practice. But it was really just that they refused, and it was a deliberate concealment. And we'll get nowhere if we haven't got honesty in all of this. And I was reflecting on sort of why did I do that? And I think it comes from my upbringing. My mum in particular was a massive rule abider. Like honesty was like critical to her, and it's a value that I've carried with me. And also, you know, carry forward. What I look at my kids and what can I honestly say that I've done if I tell them I work in transport and climate change. If I haven't done something, what I would say is a difficult process, the freedom of information request. I'm sure I've burnt some bridges, but I've built others, and I haven't burnt all of the bridges within the Department for Transport that I had in there, and I've taken a lot of comfort from the response I've had from lots of other people. I'm not a marcher. That doesn't mean that I won't march. I'm looking forward to doing it after hearing from the experiences of others on the call. But I don't have to do everything. I need to do what I can do, I think is where I come from, and sometimes take comfort from the actions that other people are doing when I feel like I'm not doing enough.
Thanks, Greg. I have to say, maybe it is because we're colleagues and friends, and you know, have followed paths similarly through academia and into practice. But it really hits quite hard emotionally for me listening to you talk, because you know, I don't think often people see behind Professor Greg Marsden as the big name doing things in the area of transport governance, to realise that you're a human with history and family and concerns. My sense as you were talking is, I'm guessing, this great frustration where we go from exploring the why or asking why, and then to the how. How are we going to address this? And then why not when we're not seeing the action that we're looking for? And then what the hell when you get to a point where you've shouted into the void and it really does feel like a void? Do you have a sense that you've gone through stages of that sort where you began thinking, surely everyone will be listening and I can use my intellect and focus on the evidence to help us all move in the right direction, to discovering that actually not everyone's on board with that?
No, I don't think I ever kind of took that position. I guess just seeing the nature of public debate over the last few years. I mean, okay, now I'm that woke science guy who's, you know, a bit annoying or whatever. But you know, I think the idea that experts are the ones that are going to solve this. I mean, I totally buy into Becky Willis's argument. Look, this needs to become more political. If things are going to change, it has to be real for people, and we have to have those difficult discussions. And part of my job is to make sure that we're not letting politicians and we're not allowing civil servants to be off the hook with what the real discussions we ought to be having are. And if, you know, I might not be the one that's kind of leading the pressure outside the council door, but it's for me to equip the groups that need that information. It's for me to challenge internally in all those other processes where I can to try and make that happen.
Great, thank you, Greg. Right, let's move on. Emma, you'll be bringing us a different dimension again to the forms of climate action that are actually out there and perhaps coalescing, we hope, in ways that Greg's just touched on.
Yes, I've been making notes, things to add to my introduction. So I'm Emma Woods. I'm the founder of Flourish Economics, which offers alternative economic thinking and aims to democratize economic thought. So that sort of draws on Greg's point about equipping people with knowledge to challenge what is happening in our society right now. So as way of background, I was a government economist, and I've worked as a public sector economist for the past sort of 13 years. But the longer that I was in those sort of public sector roles, the more it just misaligned with my own values. And I really started to question traditional economic thought, especially as my own awareness of climate change sort of grew, but also since I became a mother, and sort of concerns about what will the planet look like by the time my children are 20, 30, 40 years old. So I've been sort of learning more about alternative economics. I've stepped out of mainstream sort of neoclassical, neoliberal economics, and started to understand that there are different ways of thinking. There are different ways that we can live, which has been really empowering for myself. And I also want to pass that on to other people. So I've had a lot of conversations with people that are not economists, and there's been a lot of discussion about how economics doesn't feel very accessible, feels like the gates are closed. If you try to have conversations with policymakers or economists, it feels like there's very much, we're the experts, you're not, you stay out of this. So I've set up Flourish to provide accessible economics education so people can get that foot in the door to say, wait a minute, because you can question what is happening. You know, the economy and policy making has a direct impact on your life every day, whether we know that or not, or whether we recognize that or not. So I want to empower people to have those conversations, but also to imagine a different way of living. So there's lots of talk of utopia. There's lots of thoughts of, you know, that's so far away, we could never do that. If you talk about universal basic income, universal basic services, that just seems too distant. But I want to show people that there are small acts of rebellion, small things that you can do that sort of fight against that system that we live in. So as Hiba was saying, you know, taking time in nature, slowing down, breathing, reaching out to your community. So even if that's just writing a letter, sending it to your neighbors and saying, hey, we live next door to each other and I don't know your name. Small things like that can just help us to build community and help you to find a bit of tribe, a bit of solidarity. Because Greg mentioned about, you know, it just being relentless. You mentioned in the opening, you know, climate change, disaster can feel so tiring. But if you can find that tribe, if you can find the marches, people to join with in solidarity, I think that can really help you to get some energy to fight the good fight again.
Thank you, Emma. And I know it's true of all of you, all of us, that, you know, emotions run deep and probably varied in their forms. But I found you particularly inspiring in the sense that you could have to take the phrase, plowed the furrow of mainstream economics. You could have worked your way up the metaphorical greasy pole and been the best economist you could be in the system. And yet you've made what feels to me like this very brave, vulnerable move to found something which sounds so exciting, Flourish Economics. But can you just give us a flavour? Because I'm sure there are other people out there feeling, do I just carry on? I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got children to look after, family to care for. But what sort of emotional journey did you go on in that period where you asked yourself, can I do this? Should I do it? Gosh, I've done it. Can you give us a taste of that?
So I dug out the book that I think was one of the first steps into radicalizing me. So it's E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. I bought this on my honeymoon because I thought it sounded sarcastic and funny. I didn't realize that this was printed 50 odd years ago. And I think it's not taking it too far to say that this was quite a cornerstone of alternative economics, of environmental economics. It was a completely different way of thinking that back in the 70s, I think people were thinking, oh, this guy, who's this? Whereas now people are looking, from an economics point of view and going, oh, he really got all of this stuff. So I guess, like Steve was saying, it's hard when you're the lone person in the room going, hey, look at my book. So that was one of the first steps. But then it just built and built and built over time. As Hiba was saying, and you start to realize there are more and more books out there, and just a lot of the logic in the traditional economics that I had learned didn't make sense. And I'd always been someone that would ask difficult questions. And when I joined the transport sector, I asked some really basic questions and people couldn't answer them. And I found this with economics as well. If you put economists on the spot and say, but why do we need economic growth? What is productivity for? I think if you asked a lot of economists that, they would be quite concerned and wouldn't be able to answer necessarily, or not in a way that would satisfy you. They could give you an answer, they could give you a spiel, but if you say, but so what does this actually achieve? Does economic growth actually give us the outcomes that we want to see in our world? Then that's when it starts to fall apart. And that's when, for me, it kind of really rubbed up against my values. And I wanted to just do something different. And the pressure just grew too much for me, to the point where, I handed in my notice and decided that I needed to be self-employed.
Yeah, well, I guess from a personal point of view, I'm very proud you did that, Emma. I know that the journey ahead's uncertain, but yeah, and thank you for sharing that. Right, let's move on. Robin, what would you like to say by way of setting the scene?
Hello, yes, I'm Robin. Just very quick visual description of myself for anyone who needs it. I come from the theatre background, so we're used to saying that. I'm a white man with short brown hair, blue eyes, cream brown roll neck jumper, and I'm not clean shaven, so I'm looking a little messy. Hopefully that's useful for anyone that needs it. But yeah, I'm a climate communicator working between the corporate, public, and arts sectors, looking for new ways to shift the climate narrative. What does that mean, though? Well, it means that my life and activism entails spinning many existential climate crisis plates. That includes carbon literacy training, environmental responsibility consultancy, but I think probably the main reason why I'm here today, that includes being the co-founder, co-artistic director of Ergon Theatre, one of the UK's leading climate theatre companies. I suppose then going to my personal side of things, just as Emma is looking to make economics more accessible to people, I fervently believe that the arts have a crucial role in communicating about the climate crisis through relatable and accessible and human stories that entertain, educate, and empower, rather than communicating simply through graph statistics and huge concepts that have no immediate relevance to our daily lives. So it's my role as a storyteller I want to focus on, just talking briefly for a couple minutes now. So the climate crisis is a hyper object. It's something that is tangible and exists, but it is so vast in time and space that no human mind can really comprehend it. That hyper object, of course, though, is made up of lots of smaller objects, lots of human beings, and we want to focus our energy on these smaller objects rather than always just running head on at that impossibly big hyper object. So when making art about the climate crisis, we always start from a place where climate change is absent. We dig in and deeply explore what is most important to us in our lives, as we're talking about today, be that our relationships, cultural heritage, hobbies, the place you grew up, our favorite type of food, whatever it is. We start by interrogating what is important to us outside of the climate crisis. And the point of us focusing on what is most important to us, absent of climate change, however big or small, is to try to establish human and, most importantly, personal connections to the climate crisis. So once we have established what is most important to us, we begin our research into how that forms a part of the climate conversation, how our important thing is impacted by or impacts the climate crisis, and all of the knotted and entrenched isms and injustices that make up the crisis. For example, if having a Friday night chippy with the family is important to you, a quick Google of British fish and chips and climate change will show you that climate change is affecting British cod and haddock. They're now looking to migrate out of British waters due to the changing sea temperatures, perhaps making a mockery of Brexit taking control of our British fisheries. But there we go. But the overall point is to find our place in the climate conversation, to find our human and personal connections to the climate crisis, and to start breaking off and tackling smaller pieces of the climate change hyper object, which is, I suppose, what we're doing today. And that is actually something I also carry over into my work in consultancy and training in and outside of the arts too. I encourage anyone I work with to find their place in the climate conversation, to find their human and personal connections. Very quickly, for example, I'm currently working with a company who don't at all work in climate change, but do work exclusively in the area of the LGBTQIA2S+ star community. And in that case, just scratching the surface, we very quickly discover that that community are more disproportionately at risk due to climate change. They're more likely to care about climate change, actually. And there is a lot of empowering crossover between the climate crisis, queer theory, queer rights movements, queer protests, and queer activism. But the point is, just by discovering their place in the conversation, their personal human connections to the climate crisis, that means that when they go to their staff requesting implementation of more environmentally responsible practice and policy, it needn't feel like a box-ticking exercise, and rather instead it forms part of the backbone of why their organisation exists in the first place. It helps their staff members find their personal and human connections, and it opens up a conversation like today for them. So yeah, I encourage you all to consider what is most important to you, big or small, serious or tongue-in-cheek, and go and research how that forms a part of the conversation, because I promise you it will. And that might be your way into the conversation, into the movement of change. It might establish your climate goals. It might establish who you share your climate goals with. It might establish what your form of action could take, and importantly, highlight your human and personal motivations. And this will also help diversify the wider conversation, which is essential if we are to cumulatively tackle the hyper object of the climate crisis together. That was an awful lot and a long time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Robin. And I've just written down, although you spelled it out very effectively for us, I think, finding our place in the climate conversation. It's such a sort of simple proposition, but it does really strike me as so fundamental, because many of us, I suppose, appear as though we are fortunate in that we're in an area of professional work that lends itself immediately to tackling the big issue, and transport sector professionals on the call will know that immediately, whereas many other people perhaps don't associate fully with, well, what can they do? A sense of powerlessness. But as you beautifully illustrated with your Friday night fish and chip example, which I think is a wonderful down-to-earth connection. Certainly I can relate to that myself as alongside transport. That's really powerful. Just a quick question for you. To what extent are you finding with your audiences and your journey through climate theatre that appetite is growing for people wanting to find their place and feeling helped to find their place?
I would say, actually, within theatre, but also with training, I would say across the board that I think most people really care about climate change. Constantly people talk about apathy, and that there's this whole thing that's stopping anybody taking action because they don't care, it's too big. I actually think that's the case. I think that people aren't engaged in the conversation exactly in the way it was talked about, and I think that's the problem. There are loads of people primed, ready. It's just they've not been communicated to in the right way. And it's difficult, the question you've asked me there, because generally speaking in the theatre, there are lots of reasons for this, but we are preaching to the choir. We're talking to people who are probably kind of on side a bit already. But even within that, there is a spectrum within our audiences. And there are some people who have come along because they, within their immediate circles, don't have anybody to talk to about this kind of stuff. And actually coming to one of our shows, which are always very discursive, opens their eyes up to the fact that, yeah, they're not alone, that there are other people around them. I think I might talk a little bit later more about that, but I'm going to hold on for now so other people can talk.
That's great. Thanks, Robin. Well, for me, that's, and I have nothing against science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, I should say, but I get so frustrated when STEM is put on a pedestal as the primary route way to salvation, when I think you beautifully illustrated that the performing arts and all the cuts it's had, and sort of devaluing, one might say, from public priority, at least in government recently, it absolutely has its place. Right, Zoe, we must come to you now. Thanks for waiting till the end of the queue, as it were. But the floor's yours.
Oh, Glenn, thank you. An abrupt introduction. Well, I feel very lucky, blessed to have come at the end of these introductions. I've had the privilege to listen to everyone else, and I feel like there's a number of themes and connections, and it feels like one explicit and also implicit is around values. I think this, whatever language we use, I strongly feel that our language is not meeting the challenge at the moment. I increasingly don't use climate change, climate crisis as like it's both too big and too small and totally unsatisfactory as a set of language, and for all sorts of reasons which I may come on to. As someone who's pretty whole brain, like I do, I'm quite geeky, and I'm also a pretty feeling person. I think deeply and I feel deeply. And so I delve into the science a lot, and I also feel a lot, and I guess it's my day job as a coach for the last 14 plus 15 years, as well as having a background in public services, means that I do think and feel very deeply about all of this. So it brings us very, very fundamentally to what it is to be human, I think. If we think back of all of our stories, what's led us to be the person we are today, including for everyone listening or watching this after the effect on a recording. It's like our personal story, our upbringing, all sorts of things have led us to be the person we are in this moment. So I think primarily got my love of nature from my mum, and I primarily got my love of social justice from my dad. And our personal story makes such a difference, doesn't it? So my father's parents fled fascism between the wars. One was from Poland, one was from Romania. And my mum's dad was part French and helped the French resistance get Jews out of occupied France. So I think and some of this has only really dawned on me in later years, that I think justice and love for nature are absolutely in my blood, but so is resistance to a degree. And so is the kind of political lens and the power lens, although some of it has just kind of sunk deeper into my being as I've got older and more reflective and read more and understood more. I've been probably like many people listening to this, and I sense maybe some of us here, particularly those of older years. I'm 53. I'm a mum. I'm a very ordinary person. I'm a northern mum of I've got a 20-year-old daughter. I've cared about this social justice, natural justice, justice for nature, love for non-humans, care for our brothers and sisters, etc. It's just been part of me since I was very young, really. So I've been doing, as I'm sure many of us have, all sorts of things through most of my life, and needing to come to terms, I guess, in sort of particularly in the last decade, most acutely in 2018, coming to terms with pretty much everything I'd done had failed. And I think accepting that failure and being humble about it is a really important part of moving on and letting it go and accepting. So, I'd done all the collectivism, I've just done pretty much everything, the personal lifestyle stuff, all of it, and more formal things like co-founding a community energy company where I live and putting PV on the local school roofs and all that kind of stuff, which I'm not dissing. Community energy is great, right? But when the Cameron government cut the green crap and decimated the community energy movement overnight, that was a pretty radicalizing moment on top of many other radicalizing moments. I think, like thousands of others, discovering Extinction Rebellion in 2018 and realizing that actually, and I think this is one of a number of fantastic things that Extinction Rebellion has given as gifts to the UK and to the world, democratizing direct action and helping ordinary people to realize that actually you don't have to be a special kind of person to do some dramatic thing like Greenpeace used to do when I was a teenager. I used to look at them like they were a different category of person, like they were some super object hero, and no one like me could do stuff like that. I'm just an ordinary person from the north of England. I can't do that. It's not like me. So I realized in 2018 that actually, shit, I can do this stuff, because who the hell else is going to? And how do I look myself in the eye, look my daughter in the eye if I don't? And I've heard, you know, language along those lines from thousands of other people over time. So it might sound cliched, but yeah, I from both my rational brain and my values base, my spiritual self, my emotional self, it was an acceptance of course, I accept the science, although actually I didn't understand fully about the nature of the severity and the tipping points until 2018. I didn't understand it in the full extent because, hey, we've been lied to for so long, haven't we? Funnily enough. Even though I was an aware postgraduate and all the rest of it, I still didn't know the full truth. But the logic of civil resistance just made total sense. And it just clicked for me. It was just like, yeah, that's totally, and I kind of changed everything in my life really from that point onward. So I've been a spokesperson, a speaker trainer, a spokesperson trainer, and obviously I speak in the media on a reasonably regular basis. And I've also taken direct action on many occasions. I've been arrested 7 times. I've spent a short time in prison last year on remand just for sitting on the road, because that's what this system does nowadays. And I have a suspended sentence for being found guilty along with 6 other women for carefully cracking a window at Barclays HQ in 2021 to call them out for the biggest fossil fuel funder in Europe. I have to say, just a moment of joy, because there is so much joy in resistance. I think that's, you know, there's so much hard stuff and grief and sorrow, but my God, there's a lot of joy in resistance. And I have to share some blooming good news, 2 bits of blooming good news. One is hot off the press, if you pardon the expression, this morning, which is 9 beautiful sisters from Extinction Rebellion who've just been unanimously found not guilty this morning for breaking windows at HSBC in 2021, 2 weeks after we did the Barclays windows. I know. So it's so good. It's so good. It's, yeah. So they broke quite a number of windows to call out HSBC for being the 2nd biggest fossil fuel funder in Europe. And a jury of 12 peers, ordinary men and women in and around London, found them not guilty unanimously. So how good is that? It's just wonderful. And I don't know if anyone knows here, or I think actually some of you do, but if anyone watching doesn't realise, the good people of Netherlands actually have had a fantastic breakthrough only in the last few months. And it is really easy to feel like we're overwhelmed and it's not possible to achieve change, because I'm with you, Steve. You know, we're talking about lengthening the tunnel here. We're not turning this hyper object around. We're not turning this around completely. But for me, spiritually and ethically and existentially, it's about minimizing harm, suffering, death, horror in the time that we've got left, and maximizing joy, love, equality, and justice in the time that we've got left. That's what it's about for me. It's a really clear spiritual, ethical choice. And so that's how resistance absolutely makes sense to me. And then the people of the Netherlands peacefully resisted blocking the A12 in The Hague for 27 days in a row. Thousands and thousands of people, 9,000 arrests overall. And by the end of that period, the police unions in the Netherlands were so overwhelmed by the level of arrests that they went to the politicians and said, you have to get over your pride as politicians and talk to these people, because you're not going to arrest yourself out of this. And so they ended up having to engage with the demand of an end to fossil fuel subsidies, and the politicians are currently working up sets of options about how to do it. And Exxon Netherlands have very clearly said if they don't deliver, they'll be back on the streets. So, we have way more power than we realize. We are not going to fix this, because I don't believe there's a fix, but I do believe people power to be leveraged way more than we realize, and we have to take that. So one of my biggest messages is the importance of a very small 3-letter word, which is and. So whatever we do in the rest of our lives, whatever action we take, and we do individual stuff, we do professional stuff, I've done loads of stuff in my professional life, etc., and we can resist. If we just take a week out of our year or whatever, and we do part of resistance, the and is really important. We can't leave this to someone else, because the authoritarianism and the fascism is creeping in at an ever-increasing rate. We can see it all around us. So that resistance is essential, and there is such joy in resistance, and sometimes justice prevails. So that's me for right now, Glenn.
Thanks, Zoe. And I have to say, well, from you and from all of you, this is probably the hardest fireside chat I've done in terms of feeling my own emotions about what you're saying and what it means to me personally. I don't think I've felt so emotional before. I'm also very conscious that this is one of my PhD students once said to me, the great burden of intellect. It was a simple phrase as that we're, I think probably all of us share in being weighed down by the fact that we are intellectually activated and hungry to learn more and understand the world around us. And I'm not saying that's the preserve only of sort of academics, of people who've had higher education. But of course, some people will look at this fireside chat, well, if they've not passed it by entirely, and say, oh, look at that echo chamber, look at that bubble of lefty, woke tofu eating wokerati. And what I'd like to come to is, we're in a place where we've made sense of some of this. The idea we can contemplate fascism and not just be watching Gogglebox on a Friday with our fish and chips, that Robin may or may not have opened our minds to being a more complex topic than we thought. So many people are deliberately being presented with an airbrushed view of the society around them, because it suits that way forward for wider society and those with vested interest. So I wanted to come to this notion of, how do we see a clearer connection with wider society across the political spectrum, as well as different levels of agency. And perhaps, Steve, I can come to you, because I don't claim to have much experience of protest, but I did go to the big one with Robin and others in April this year. And what struck me, and of course it's incredibly superficial, but it really struck me that around me were these very sort of characteristic, archetypally looking left-wing wokerati type folk, in sort of just the style they were dressed and engaging and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's their choice, and I wouldn't deny anyone a choice of how they want to present themselves. But later in the year, we saw queues of business people in London queuing up to make their statement, and it seemed from a performative perspective that was playing in a different way to perhaps different audiences. So I wondered, Steve, I haven't really put a question in there, but what do you make of this question of how to engage beyond the bubble of the left, or of the liberal left that's already invested in this agenda?
It's easier to talk about the problem than it is the solution. I'll try and say a few words about that at the end. But this is something I've been concerned about right from the beginning. Back in 2019, when there was that huge upsurge with XR and the Fridays for the Future, one of the key things that happened was that it shifted public opinion across the whole range, including quite a lot of sort of soft conservative people. And that really frightened the fossil fuel lobby and their supporters. And so they moved into action very quickly, obviously using the media that they influence, and particularly an organization called Policy Exchange, which is a covert lobby group masquerading as a think tank. And they did a highly influential report called Extremism Rebellion, which wasn't aimed directly at the general public, but it was aimed at opinion formers to say these people who are banging on about climate change are anti-capitalist, anti-British extremists. Now, unfortunately, some of the activist communities can sometimes be their own worst enemy. One of the own goals, which I think XR and a number of organisations have scored, is to allow their campaign to be associated with other divisive left-wing issues. I mean, one of mine, for example, is reparations for slavery, which has featured very prominently in quite a lot of the things that I've been to. Leaving aside whether that's right or wrong, that there is a lot of research that says where an issue becomes associated with a political cleavage, so like Brexit or gun control in America, a social movement will find it very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve change. And of course, that's precisely what the fossil fuel lobby wanted to do, because they understand this. And interestingly on that, another piece of research showed that if you take the gun law example, in America, despite the fact that a large majority of people favour greater control of gun laws, for conservative voters, any candidate talking about that, it will make them less likely to vote for them, despite the fact that they personally might support greater gun controls. So that's the paradox. And I think that partly explains what happened in 2019, where that huge upsurge of concern about climate change in Britain made absolutely zilch influence on the general election which followed. Yeah. How do we get out of all that? With great difficulty. And I'm not sure that it's something we can necessarily, certainly the activist movement can't do it on their own, but step number one, I would say, divorce from other issues, change your language and learn to speak in different language to different audiences.
I'm gonna thank you for that. I'm actually gonna, based on what you said, bring Robin back in, because I completely get your point about beware of association with another issue that allows a cleavage to be created. And yet, of course, what Robin was saying to us in his introduction was, in actual fact, diffuse that by allowing everyone to find their place in the climate conversation with another issue that means something to them, but not a single point issue that is, then allowing that division. So I don't know, Robin, do you see any tension with what Steve said? Or is your approach actually a way of avoiding that very problem?
Well, I'm not sure how I suppose my immediate reaction would be, it's not necessarily to disagree, I don't think, but that the climate crisis is not a thing that we're trying to change, right? It is so many different things that are making it up. It is all of your neoliberalism and capitalism and neocolonialism, and it's just such a massive, huge thing. It is economics. It is the way that we report. It's systemic as well as being technical and managerial. So I suppose, yeah, I would perhaps disagree a little bit in the sense that I think it is intersectional, but then I sort of struggle to think if you're just going to tackle climate change, what are you actually tackling? The problem is climate change. That's not the solution, and the problem is not actually climate change. The problem is everything that's causing climate change, and that is so multifaceted. So I guess, but then that again comes down to language, I suppose. Really, I'd be interested to hear what Steve's reaction to that is, because I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question, because climate change is so big, so I'm not really sure where to go.
Let me move it around a bit more, though, if I may. So, I mean, Hiba, from your point of view, you mentioned these many projects that you preside over now. What's your sense, in the same way as you've been building up in your own journey of climate action, what do you see across the different teams and the approaches that these projects take? Do you get a sense of them and us, that you're the lefty person who comes in and says all the good things, but actually most people don't really understand why that should be all consuming, and they want to just get on with what they've always done and get what they always got? How do you experience that issue?
I guess not really. I mean, I guess I feel like the reminder that just pops up for people who are just trying to do 17 other things, and every now and then you just need a don't forget this, don't forget that, and usually very well received, or just to look at it in a different way. I think that's the best part of looking across sectors. Like, oh, did you know that they did this in education, or have you ever seen what they did in water in this project, and just giving them a bit of perspective. But no, never any pushback, and always quite receptive and open to change.
Yeah, and Greg, coming across to you perhaps. So it's partly this question of do you feel very conscious of being in an echo chamber, even if it's got a kind of fuzzy boundary to it, or are you finding in your work that this is an all-comers agenda now, that you're reaching into all the territories and not in an echo chamber?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I guess reflecting on can you talk about climate change sort of separate from everything else? Well, I think in some senses Fridays for the Future movement and XR, as we were saying, I think it did bring it to the public conscience. Raising it as an issue is different with dealing with it as an issue, and I think that's where you have to reach out into everyone's lives and how they live and have those conversations about, well, what needs to be different and why climate change matters to that. I mean, we've got a terrible history of failing to make progress on other social issues that we've talked about tackling. I mean, just within the transport domain, we've been fixing congestion ever since I started studying transport, and it's got worse ever since I started studying transport. So what, if we treat climate like that, then we're doing. So climate is a different type of problem. I mean, I think the plan for motorists that came out of the Department for Transport, I think is actually a reminder of the fact that if you operate in an echo chamber, then at some point the interests that you're ignoring are going to kick back, and that's been deeply unhelpful. And I think sometimes the division in like the narrative about sustainable transport is basically, well, if you don't use a car, tick; if you do use a car, cross. And I think that again just bifurcates people totally unhelpfully, and we've got to find language and solutions that meet the needs of society. So I think I'm kind of I agree with parts of what Steve said, and I agree with parts of what Robin said. That it is really complicated to find that balance.
Thank you. And so I'm going to come back to you now, because not that I hasten to add, I'm not an avid GB News viewer, but I tend to find myself watching it when I've seen my climate heroes appearing on it. I can recall an awful episode where a young climate activist was being laughed at for talking about wet bulb temperatures and loss of life due to temperatures last year, laughed at by the presenters. You've very bravely held your nerve, held your composure, and appeared on those sorts of outlets. Tell us a little bit about how you approach that and how you feel and how you break through from going beyond being in some sense, the sort of token woke person they've got on that they can prod, to trying to connect genuinely with the audience for that show.
Oh, quite a few questions there, Glenn. I hope you can hear me all right. I was having a few tech issues for the last few minutes. Apologies.
All good.
Yeah, gosh, a few. And yes, it was my young friend and colleague Alex who was treated in a most appalling way in that GB News interview with those two presenters and we mustn't forget, actually, when you do an interview, any interview pretty much on that, mainstream media, probably even more so in the likes of GB News, Talk TV, like the presenters have things in their ears like this, so you're not actually talking to one or two presenters, you're actually up against a whole team of people which are funded by oil interests behind them. Just picking up on the political realities that Steve was linking to earlier with Policy Exchange. So when you've got GB News, which was, funded by, I think, 100 million quid initially by someone who's got major oil interests and blah, 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 blah. You've actually got a whole team of people in their ear telling them what to say and what not to say and how to goad the person, because they're after clicks, because they're commercial organisations, and they're after stoking division and hatred and denial, because that's their business. So it's, I guess, to come back to your question, understand what you're actually facing. they're a business, and they're a business with an agenda that's trying to push denial, division, hatred, etc. That's their job. So see them for what they are. Also, understand that just like when you sit on a road or crack a bank window or march to the point of arrest, like Just Stop Oil supporters have been doing for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, on and off over the course of the last 18 months. Doing an interview as a, I don't like the word activist, to be honest, but doing an interview in the media is an action in its own right. It is a piece of direct action. So it's really important to not accept the framing that we're given, because it's a nonsense. The whole, the media companies, whether they're the far right denialist ones or the generally moderate right, slightly less denialist ones, their framing is nonsense. The framing is business as usual, which is extractive, patriarchal, capitalist nonsense, which has created this whole setup. So we have to just break through the framing and not accept it. So that's why, for example, I sat down on the floor in the Sky News interview. Not that Sky News is far right, but they're still part of the system, right? And they're still essentially a commercial organization that's trying to get clicks and advertising. So we have to break patterns, and we also, I think, which comes through practice and with support and work on ourselves, is to try, although it's not easy, to try really hard to not take it personally, whatever attacks and stuff that you get, because actually, it could be any of us in that situation, and we'd get the same sort of attacks. Yeah. And also, as you'll have seen, if you have watched, as soon as they finish an interview with us, they get on to an interview about the price of fish or something. It's like it's just clicks, it's just throughput, it's just nonsense for them. They're just doing their job. It's what it reminds me of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. They're just doing their job. They're upholding evil, effectively. So it might sound dramatic, but we're talking about climate genocide here, aren't we? So they are just upholding evil, and we have to just cut through the nonsense and say it how it is, and be brave, because I think connecting with purpose, connecting with why we're doing this stuff is super important when we're going into interviews. And we need to be purpose powered when we're doing it. And I think that goes the same in any conversations, actually, or meetings in work or anything. It's like I've said so many times that I can't even remember how many times now, in lots of different audiences, personal and professional, including with my own profession of coaches nationally and internationally, is we need to recalibrate our risk. The risks that we might have thought there was a little bit risky to say such and such in a meeting. Like, you're joking, aren't you? Our food supply is collapsing and our economy is going to fall over. Everything is at risk. So let's just recalibrate our risk rating and think, well, being a tiddly bit awkward in a meeting isn't really a big risk. So let's upscale our risk and keep upscaling our risk to see what we're capable of, because we're all capable of so much more. And I think the only thing we're going to regret in the weeks and months ahead is that we didn't do stuff. And at the same time, as Hiba and Emma and others have said, that we don't slow down and be present and have those moments of joy and renewal and regeneration with our families and our communities. And that's really important. But I honestly believe that we can do both. That's back to that word "and." We can be present, we can renew ourselves, we can regenerate, we can love and laugh and have joy with others in this tribe. And we can keep stepping up, because we're never going to need to not resist, unfortunately, because this is the rest of our lives. And resistance shows in lots of different ways. And I think resistance in the media and in public conversations is super important.
Thanks, Zoe. And I think recalibrating risk captures a lot of my thinking really well. I've presented several times recently around this notion of agency and risk appetite being two key kind of dimensions to each individual in terms of what they're prepared to do. I know my wife regularly says to me, please don't lose your job today, and I'm not in anywhere close to doing some of the things that we've heard from others of you on the call. What I'd like to do, using that as a sort of segue, is come to the questions that we posed for the event itself, and I know each of you have sort of expressed an interest in offering up some thoughts on those, so I'm going to work my way through. Emma, starting with you, and again, I'm hoping people on the call are being inspired and reflecting on what this means for them. Are they recalibrating their risk in real time as they're listening to this discussion? But how can someone best determine what climate action is right for them to take? Emma, any advice on that, or what's your sense?
So I think we've already talked about it through this discussion, but I wanted to bring up sort of your own values and your own sort of privilege and power, but also that element of the sort of worry of the impact this might have on your job. So I'll come back to those points. I was going to say as well, though, that I didn't really talk about how economics and climate change are intertwined. So I'll try and cover all those bits fairly quickly because I know we've got a lot of questions to get through. So I think the values point is really important because there's no point in you taking action that doesn't sort of fit with you. I think a few people have said that. So finding action that chimes with you, and that will look different for everybody. But I also wanted to acknowledge, that I know I'm hugely privileged to be able to have been in a position to have left my secure employment and go into self-employment. And I know that not everybody would be in that situation. So I think we have to acknowledge that. I don't think we can be in our high tower and go, hey, you're doing a job that might be in an industry that I don't personally agree with, but are they in a position? Because ultimately, if you're in that insecure position, it's because of the economic system that we are in. And I think this is how it sort of explains the interconnectedness of climate change, economic system, but also sort of systems of oppression and exploitation and extraction. So, I think pretty much everybody has to have some form of employment pretty much. You need to feed yourself, and if you've got family, you need to be able to feed them and provide shelter as well. So the economic system that we have creates that insecurity, and this again links through to your kind of employment. So when I was in the public sector, I was terrified of having conversations like this. I never would have put anything on social media for fear of losing my job. I mean, I was in the civil service, so there were rules around what you could say and what could be deemed political. But I do worry that almost the censorship, and this kind of idea of free speech. Do we have free speech if, I feel like I can't actually speak my truth, if you like, or I can't live my values for fear that my employer might, terminate my employment in the worst case scenario? So I think there's some interesting things there around kind of free speech, around democracy, but also, there are marginalized groups that don't have the privilege of not acting. So there are groups within our society where their existence is denied. A lot of conversations at the moment around trans rights. Do trans people exist? Some politicians are questioning that. And, if you are in marginalized groups, you're almost forced to take action just to say, hey, I am a real person. I do exist. So I realize I've kind of spun out lots of different threads there around privilege, power, but I think social justice, racial justice, climate justice, and economic justice are all very closely intertwined. And I think that's why it's so difficult when we talk about, campaigning on single actions and kind of muddying the waters, I guess, and getting political. That's probably where a lot of the messaging and the language has become quite difficult and quite entangled.
Yeah.
So I apologize, Glenn, for that
No,
kind of
not at
very
all, Emma.
messy response.
No,
But
no, very
hopefully that
helpful.
helped.
And I think, well, there's clearly a theme coming through the conversation around interconnectedness. And I think for me, it feels like it's navigating interconnectedness because, of course, it's not straightforward. I think you've also very nicely illustrated that the action each and every one of us is prepared to take is a changing prospect over time. Absolutely agree. There are things I do and say today that I wouldn't have dreamt of doing 5 years ago, at least if I wanted to keep my job and not burn the bridges that Greg was talking about earlier. But I find more and more that people are actually coming up behind you and saying, you said what I wanted to. but I wasn't feeling able to, but perhaps they will feel in another year or so. Steve, can I come to you next? Because, well, you've, as Zoe has, been arrested. You've been an arrestable in XR language. But what are the risks and rewards then for you of taking climate action when you look back, or if you're giving advice to others? And I know we've heard some of that. Hiba mentioned, the sheer joy that can come to you from knowing you're taking action. But any thoughts from you on that question?
Okay. I'll try to be brief on this because I could talk all day. The risks are very clear when you are in employment, and as you will remember, Glenn, I felt them very keenly for having been probably one of the first people to sort of stick my head above the parapet within academia. I was threatened. My employment was threatened by an indirect method. It was bizarrely, it was shown to me by a senior manager on his personal phone because they didn't want to leave any trace of it. The Department for Transport, with whom I had previously worked on some projects, said, we're not having this guy on the next research project. In the end, none of that mattered a great deal. To me personally, I was only a few years off retirement anyway. I can imagine how younger people with a mortgage or something, that might feel much worse. As regards the what can you get out of it, the answer to that is very personal, but I'll share just one reflection, which is this. Sorry.
It's all right, take your time, Steve.
Yeah, sorry, this stuff does get me very emotional, but when you are in that situation, when you've been handcuffed, you're being led away by the police, you feel this tremendous sense of peace coming over you, that you've done what's the right thing, it's now out of your hands, and it's for others to do their bit. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I don't think I need to add to that. I'm sure we're all feeling through what you've just said there. Just to say, on a procedural point, we were denied for whatever reason our prompt start earlier this afternoon. I'm pleased to say all the panel members are available to run our full hour and a half together, so we will be here until 2:15 for those of you in the audience who can stay with us. Of course, if you have to leave earlier, please come to the recording afterwards. And perhaps picking up the threads from that very touching point from you, Steve, I'll come across to you, Robin, to the question of what effect can taking climate action have on those around you, around us, because it's not just ever one person making their call purely in their own interest or with their own emotional motivation. What's your reaction to that, or your advice perhaps to others about how they must tread carefully?
I think, God, again, multiple things you could say around that. I think our biggest superpower as individuals, at least, but also as groups, is influence through action. I think the idea is simply by taking action, you might influence someone else to take positive action too. Problem is with that superpower is that you often have no idea of its effect. You don't necessarily know who you're influencing. I would say certainly yourself, Steve, but actually everyone on this call. I am Glenn's son, and Dad and I have talked, I think, about all of you in quite inspired ways, and that certainly inspired me to take further action. So even that just being an example, but I've never spoken to any of you before particularly, so why would you know that? So it's a gift and a curse in a way, I think, but I've personally find that notion of influence through action so important to hold on to whenever I do feel sort of alone in the climate action space, whenever I'm losing motivation. And I also think there's something, to go slightly tangenty away, but we often talk about preaching to the choir, certainly within the climate theatre side of things, like the audiences we get, I mentioned earlier, they're probably people already on side, and preaching to the converted. And that's made to sound like a negative thing, but I think actually we should instead view it as rallying the choir, that we can take action to inspire others and to rally those that perhaps are alone and stripped of their motivation, who need someone to remind them that are not alone, and need someone to remind them that they will take the torch on from you. They want to be rallied. I I think someone else can talk about a bit more about this in a way, but to segue very quickly, I think it's so important to talk about rallying and finding motivation and rallying other people, because there's this thing called the melancholy of the left, which very quickly is the notion that on the right hand of the political spectrum, we have our capitalism and neoliberalism and colonialism and all of the things that we might say are the foundations of the climate crisis. And then on the left hand, we point at those things and go, that's the problem, that's the problem. But then we end up going, but that's the system, but we can't do anything about it. And we sit into this melancholy where we are deactivated. And it's that melancholy that deactivates us actually sustains everything that's on the right. And so it's really difficult, but we have to try to break through that wall, that brick wall of melancholy, and think, just keep on taking action, however big or small, because the alternative is to just sustain whatever else is going on. And I think, really holding faith that you will inspire other people, as everyone on this call has inspired me before. But I do very quickly also think that the question of what effect can taking climate action have on those around you, I think you've also got to consider sometimes yourself that you can't influence everybody. There are different spheres of influence, and we all have different individual skills. And I know, for example, with yourself, Dad, I know previously you have said that despite all of the work that I know you're doing in this space, when you've been at home and you've been with some family friends in the area that we come from, having a meal at a pub, and you're the only one with your vegetarian meal, and everyone's going, haha, why is he having this vegetarian meal? You know, this eco guy, that's got you quite down. He's like, if I can't influence my immediate friends and family, what am I doing? But that is, you don't need to influence everybody. You know, the impact you're having in different spheres, the impact, even not to gush over you, Dad, but even the impact of you chairing this fireside chat is a different sphere of influence to your immediate friends and family. Yes, I'll stop there.
Thanks for that. Lots of important thoughts you've shared there. And of course, I was expecting this to be, as I say, a very human and vulnerable conversation, perhaps for us all. So, Hiba, in that vein, if I can continue and come to a question for you, which is, how do you see climate action relating to mental health? And you know, of course, how that should be managed, can be managed, and perhaps any personal experiences you've had.
Yeah, I mean, it's so intertwined with mental health. And I think, a natural approach to pain, you know, the radiator's hot, you touch the radiator, you take the hand off the radiator because it burns. You don't continue to hold the radiator or continue to hold the hot thing. That's usually the approach. So looking into something so painful, you know, I used to, and I've really struggled with it, I used to sit and cry and think about a polar bear, and that polar bear was really sad and he didn't have any food, and I just couldn't really handle dealing with all of those feelings. And so the tendency to kind of shy away from that or put it in a box and all of that stuff, that's a very protectionist measure. And if you're not going to do that, it will impact your mental health. And the difficult conversations you have, or, you know, writing something on LinkedIn and it being taken the wrong way, that all of those things, they put you in a very vulnerable position when it comes to your mental health. I guess how to counteract that, the main thing for me was understanding that you can only do what you can do. You know, if you have to think about the seriousness of that polar bear and be really sad, you can still go out for a coffee with a friend. You have to be able to compartmentalize that and say, I can do what I can do. And the counter to that, I guess, is I can imagine, you know, towards the end of my life, looking back on it. And I think the impact of knowing that I did do what I could do realistically, and the impact that will bring at a time that's probably more difficult than this, would probably be more extreme weather will be what then weathers and gives you the resilience on your mental health at a later stage.
Thanks, Hiba. Sorry, I find myself, and I know some of you have heard before, thinking about The Matrix, because I think, as well as Steve talking about that sense of peace, it's also that sense of liberation, of knowing that you've taken, and I don't mean the weaponized version of this, but you've taken the red pill out of Morpheus's hand and you pull down the curtain and you can see, you know, the dirty reality for what it is, but you feel alive because you've done that, rather than allowing the blue pill to drag you back into that airbrushed version of reality, which could so easily allow us in the eye of this storm to just put Gogglebox on and worry about what we're going to do, the following morning. I'm going to indulge, if I may, because I wanted at the start, and we missed that opportunity to hear from the audience. So before Zoe and Greg, I come to you with a bit more of a forward look as we move our way into the last quarter of an hour. Hoping this will now work. And for those of you who are still in the audience, perhaps about needing to depart to other meetings, I'd just like to ask you 3 Menti questions. So I think Brogan will, or if she hasn't already done, put the link to this in the chat, and all being well, we'll be able to move to 3 questions that I'd just like to ask of the audience. And my goodness, thanks, people are already in there. So I'll just give you a couple more moments. We'll see how many others have a chance to respond. You should be able to, if you've not found the link in the chat bar, pull from what you see on screen. We've got some responses already, so perhaps I'll do the reveal. Of course, not aware of how many of you sat in the audience still able to engage with this. So let's see. And of course, these words come from having been in a conversation or listening into a conversation for the last hour or so. Please keep them coming in. It's all anonymous, I should add, so no words are off limits in terms of how you'd like to articulate your feelings, and we'll be able to share this, of course, on YouTube afterwards, so your words will be indelibly placed on the screen for others to reflect upon, as indeed they reflect upon this wonderful conversation. Conscious you're all gearing up out there to get into this Menti stage, so I'll just allow a few more moments for comments to be added, and then we will move on to the next question, because I want to come back into the conversation as soon as possible. And I'm sorry, it's not in any way seeing these words it's a surprise, or in some respects giving us a huge uplift, but I think it's perhaps a connectedness across us all that it helps to demonstrate. Okay, pause for a moment longer, but then I will move us on to the next question. So thank you to all of you who've contributed to that. So the next question, again, this is anonymous, and it's a little bit abstract, but how active are you in trying to make a positive difference across these 3 broad dimensions to activism, from not at all to full on? Again, I'll just allow you a few moments to gather your thoughts before we sort of reveal what you're all indicating. I don't think this will be making its way into an international peer-reviewed journal, but nevertheless, it will just give us a taste of the mood in the room in our audience today. So let's have a look at where we've got to with those responses. So perhaps not surprisingly, for those of you who made the choice to give up some of your time today to join us, you are, for the most part, feeling very activated in terms of your personal lives, and within the gift that each of us have to control what we do in our professional lives. Emma perhaps being a trailblazer for pretty much changing tracks altogether, quite a strong sense that people are doing things in their professional lives too. Not a surprise, I suppose, that involvement in public protest is lower overall, but at the same time, far from insignificant, and I could well imagine that will continue over time as a shifting picture. So to our last question, I will return to Greg and Zoe. I don't like predicting the future, but if you were betting on what the future has in store in terms of the climate emergency, which one would you each pick from these possibilities? Is it too little, too late, too bad? Did we green business as usual in the nick of time? Are we looking ahead at shocks and system change? Or is anyone still hanging out for the realization it wasn't humans' fault after all? All anonymous, as I say. There's no obligation for you to move in one direction on your choices. just give a couple more moments to let a few more reactions feed in to that last question. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, a huge sample of 16 and counting. The numbers are going up, but yeah, that's not surprising, really, particularly in light of the conversation that we've been having. Well, thank you all for offering your thoughts up from the audience. I'm sorry we didn't get the chance to do that at the beginning, but I will now pause for one more moment in case anyone's about to click their button. No, I think we've got people's thoughts in. So with that, I'll stop sharing, if you don't mind, and come back into the conversation. So perhaps Greg first, and then Zoe, as we move into the closing minutes. What do you see as the outlook for climate action over the years ahead? And I'm partly asking you to think at a personal level, but also, as brief as you can, to take stock of the changing world and context around us. 1.5 slipping out of reach, COP28 coming up with a CEO of an oil company looking to pump more oil while using magic technologies to suck carbon out the air to offset that. So the climate action you've already engaged in, but what's the outlook for that for you and for all of us over the years ahead? Greg, can I come to you first on that?
Yeah, just start with an observation from Fridays for the Future at COP26. If COP was the answer, we wouldn't be on number 26 or 28 as it is now. So yeah, I mean, I know we need international discussions on these things, but pinning hope on the COP as a process, I think, is very difficult for me. I mean, we are failing, so it's not 1.5 degrees for me. It's how much more than 1.5 degrees, and I think that's one of the big challenges, right? So how do we respond to planning to fail? So I think there's climate change legislation feels like a bit of a safety net to people working in this, that we are committed to, the pathways that are set out. I think one of the responses we're already seeing with the recent rollbacks from the Sunak government is, in fact, it will be onto discourses of delay. We're doing better than other people. It's not our fault. It's not 1.5 degrees. It's 2. So pushing things to the right, rewriting legislation, that's all up for grabs in the future. So I think it's really very much about how the public responds to this. What are we going to demand better when we're failing to meet our targets? Do we tolerate it and drift on, or do we, is there a rise up and a demand for something different? And I do think that is all to play for. And I think, more and more people like us and others that have been watching this, we've got a massive role to play in, just, for me at least, if we are going to drift on and not do enough, let's not feel like that debate wasn't had. We can't decide for everyone, but we can at least play our part in really trying to make the implications of that for real. I can't believe how annoyed people get about there not being enough peppers in Tesco or whatever last summer. You ain't seen nothing yet. People need to really understand this.
Yeah, I mean, that has such huge gravity, doesn't it? I don't think it's back to Robin's notion of a high project. I just don't think we can comprehend that this might be the thin end of the wedge. The phrase that often comes to my mind is everything was all right and then it wasn't. And I don't think people appreciate how the then it wasn't could happen so quickly in a cascading type way. And we've seen planetary boundaries breached, of course, already. Zoe, over to you. When you look forward, you've taken so much climate action in all different shapes and forms. Where do you see the future for all those forms of action?
Thanks, Glenn. And oh my goodness, I could speak for an hour on this, so I'm going to challenge to try and fit it all in a small space of time. And I guess the truth is no one knows the future, but I'll just express what I feel is futurists often say you can see the future because you can see it in what's already around and already emerging. Just to pick up on some threads, I mean, and going back a little bit to then go forward, like millions and millions of people hundreds of millions of people are feeling this now, aren't they? Food insecurity globally has been spiking since 2018, 2019. 20,000 plus babies and children in Somalia have died in the last, I think, 3 years in the climate drought there. It's real now, isn't it? And 14 million people, one in 5 people in this country are food insecure, or not sure that they could feed their families for the coming weeks, kind of thing. Like, that's shit, isn't it? Let's just call it what it is. It's shit. If we go back to the systemic drivers of all of this, the greed, inequality, elite extraction to the nth degree, the financialization of everything, blah, 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 it's all the same thing, isn't it? So we have to join the dots. What we're really fighting here is utter injustice, isn't it? And ultimately, we're fighting genocide, whether it's calling for a ceasefire in Gaza or calling for an end to new fossil fuels and calling for an end to deforestation and an end to colonial extraction. It's all kind of the same thing. And I don't know if anyone follows the absolutely brilliant Julia Steinberger on Twitter, who I love her dearly. And she did a very powerful Twitter thread about 3 weeks ago that's really worth digging out about Gaza. And in that, she quoted a tweet and a statement from the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, which I looked up in full, and it's really impactful. I really, really recommend people digging it out. And I just wrote down one line from that to quote in this session. And he said, one of the lines he said is, "Gaza is just the first experiment in considering us all disposable." Now, he's writing that primarily from a Global South perspective, but not just from a Global South perspective. The people in power consider us disposable, don't they? That's true, because otherwise, why would they be accepting that one in five people in the UK don't know if they can feed their kids in the coming weeks? Right back to Insulate Britain days when we were, shouting non-violently at the top of our voices about winter deaths, people being allowed to die in their own homes because they have to choose between heating and eating. The people in power don't care. They don't care. And we're seeing it even more gruesomely on our screens day in, day out. So, and when I don't know if anyone's read James Hansen and Co.'s very recent paper about climate sensitivity. That's also a strong recommendation. I won't go into it now because there isn't time, but suffice it to say, it concludes that the IPCC climate sensitivity data is wrong and is too conservative. And he's, a peer-reviewed paper calling for revolutionary change. So you don't have to be Roger Hallam calling for revolutionary change. This is James Hansen, NASA climate scientist, calling for revolutionary change. It's obvious that we need revolutionary change, and obviously peaceful revolutions are better than violent ones. We need to find our tribe. We need to come together in solidarity for all of those, all of us, 99%, that strength and solidarity. I mean, the 3 words, 3 R's, not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but 3 R's of resistance, resilience, and regeneration. I think that for me, they're rebounding in my ears on a regular basis. And I think you can think about resistance, resilience, and regeneration individually, community, national, international, global. It works at every level, and we can apply ourselves in all of those spaces. From wonderful, very local work, or relatively local work in Scotland being done by a fantastic campaign that people really should look up called This Is Rigged. They're doing wonderful work on food solidarity and calling out the need for food to be a human right for all people in Scotland, through to the Exile Netherlands stuff that we've talked about, through to the Humanity Project that's working on community assemblies at every community across the UK. And calling for ceasefire, getting on the road with Just Stop Oil. We need to do all of this, and also defend our democracy in every way we possibly can, and fight for more and better democracy, like people working on the Defend Our Juries campaign. So, getting it over till it's over, and it's about what it is to be human. And we come together, we find joy, we find love, and we keep fighting. What else can we do?
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you. And I think your remarks, and those of all of you, of course, just a reminder of the enormity of the issues that we're facing. As you were making your remarks, I mean, I still find it surreal. I was looking at the news feed this morning. How can a sitting government have on their podium cheap slogans like "stop the boats" and long-term decisions for a better future? That's just at one level where if you tuned in and you've been asleep for 15 years, you'd surely be wondering what on earth you'd stumbled into. If I can just sum up, and I'll pass back to Brogan, two things that stood out for me amongst so many. I do think Robin's notion of finding our place in the climate conversation seems so pertinent to many things we've said, and the interconnectedness. But also, and I hope for those watching now or later, Zoe's point about recalibrating risk. We're all in this boat together, and I think all the people on the call, certainly all our panel members, have been recalibrating and continue to recalibrate their own personal risk and using their agency. Thank you to our panel for being just so honest, open, and vulnerable today. I hope that that's been beneficial to the audience. It certainly has been for me, and it's been so touching. Brogan, you and I have done many fireside chats. I don't think this was the type of conversation we imagined when the pandemic first hit and we were talking about nice, tangible, technical subjects which themselves were difficult enough, like the future of public transport or the place of walking and what's the future of modelling. But today, we've said and heard things that perhaps we didn't imagine as professionals we would find ourselves in the space of engaging with, but it just feels, like it or not, so important for the place we're all at right now, living our lives. So thank you all. I'm sorry if we've run on a little bit longer than you'd imagined in terms of your afternoon. Brogan, back to you to sign off.
I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you wonderful speakers. This was a great conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us, followed us around YouTube for 5 minutes there. And I hope we see you all on the recording soon.